This weather pattern coming is about to shock a lot of people, and I mean that in a good way for some of you, and maybe not so much for others, depending on where you live. We are heading into a genuinely big pattern change over the next week to 10 days, and on top of that, we've got a partial solar eclipse coming up that I want to make sure everybody knows about, including exactly who has the best shot at seeing it. So I'm going to walk you through everything you need to know, starting with the bigger picture pattern shift, then getting into our day-by-day temperature outlook, our severe weather threat for the days ahead, and finally the eclipse details. Happy to have you here with me today, so let's get right into it. Let's start with the big picture, because I think understanding the overall pattern shift is going to help everything else make a lot more sense. Right now, and really, for the past several weeks, we've been locked into a pattern where the heat has been parked over the western and south central United States, and honestly, it's been relentless in some of those spots with temperatures well over 100 degrees on a near daily basis. That's not going away entirely, and I want to be upfront about that right off the bat. But what is changing is how the rest of the country, particularly the central and eastern US, is going to feel over the next week or so, because we're going to start seeing these cooler air masses drop down out of Canada on a much more regular basis. If you look at our Pacific North American pattern, which is one of the key indices meteorologists use to get a sense of the broader jet stream configuration, we've been sitting in a fairly strongly positive phase. Phase is really what's been locking that heat ridge in place over the west. But as we move through this middle of this month, the guidance is showing that index trending toward more of a neutral state, and in some of the ensemble members, even flirting with slightly negative territory. When that happens, the jet stream tends to buckle a bit more, allowing these dips of cooler air to punch further south than they have been able to over the past several weeks. Now, I don't want anyone to get the wrong idea here. This is still August, and reinforcing heat is going to be part of our daily story, regardless of what the broader pattern is doing. And what we're really talking about is an increase in the frequency and strength of these cooler intrusions, especially overnight and in the mornings, rather than a complete flip to fall-like conditions. That said, if you look further out toward the back half of August and into September, the trend really does start to look more significant. Our Arctic Oscillation Index, which gives us a sense of how much cold air is bottled up near the pole versus how much of it is escaping southward, is showing a notable dip right around the middle of the month. And that's typically a sign that we're going to see stronger, more sustained shots of cooler air working their way into the central and eastern US as we head toward the end of summer. So here's how I'd sum up the big picture. Over the next week, expect a series of cool fronts to sweep through the Central Plains into the Great Lakes and eventually the eastern United States, each one bringing a day or two of noticeably cooler, more comfortable temperatures before the heat tries to build back in behind it. Meanwhile, the western and south central U.S. is going to remain locked in that stubborn heat pattern, with little relief in sight for those areas over the next several days. And as we look toward the back half of the month and into September, I do think we start to see a more decisive and lasting shift toward cooler, more fall-like intrusions, especially for those of you along and north of the jet stream. These cool fronts are also going to be important for another reason, and that's severe weather, because fronts are essentially the trigger mechanism for a lot of our thunderstorm activity. Whenever you get a front pushing into a warm, humid air mass, that creates lift, and lift is what turns available instability into actual thunderstorms. So as these fronts continue to march through over the next several days, I do expect chances for severe weather to pick up, especially across parts of the Midwest, the Ohio Valley, and eventually the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast as we get into the weekend. Let's get into the day-by-day temperature outlook now, because I know a lot of you just want to know what to expect where you live. Starting with the beginning of next week, I think we see our first real taste of this cooler air arriving, with morning lows dropping into the 50s and 60s across a good chunk of the central and northern tier of the country. But I want to reiterate, daytime highs are still going to rebound with plenty of heat behind these. So this is very much a pattern of cooler mornings and evenings sandwiched around still warm afternoons, at least in the early going. Meanwhile, across the central and south central US, along with the desert southwest, temperatures are going to remain firmly entrenched in the triple digits, with some spots likely pushing past 110 or even 115 degrees in the hottest locations. The Pacific Northwest will also stay on the warmer side, generally running into the 90s for many locations. As we move into the middle of next week, I think we start to see some of these cooler intrusions have a bit more staying power, particularly across the Great Lakes, Ohio Valley, and interior Northeast, where I could see daytime highs struggling to get out of the 70s for a day or two. That's going to feel like a genuinely refreshing break for a lot of folks who have been dealing with a stretch of hot, humid summer weather. But true to form for August, I do expect the heat to try to build back in by the latter part of the week, so don't get too used to those cooler afternoons just yet. Heading toward next weekend, the pattern looks like it continues to favor this back and forth setup, with cooler air working in overnight but daytime highs staying elevated, particularly the further west you go. I think by the time we get to the following Sunday and Monday, the eastern half of the country is going to be enjoying a noticeably more comfortable stretch, while the western U.S. continues to bake under that persistent heat ridge. So really, the theme for the next week and a half is this ongoing tug of war between reinforcing heat and increasingly frequent shots of cooler air, with the cooler air gradually gaining a bit more ground as we move deeper into the month. Now let's talk about our severe weather threat for the next several days, because there is going to be some active weather riding along with these frontal passages. For today and tomorrow, I'd characterize the overall severe weather threat as being on the lower end, but that doesn't mean it's nothing, so let's break it down. Today, the primary concern is going to be damaging winds, including the potential for a few gusts strong enough to be classified as hurricane force in the most intense cells. I do think there's a small isolated tornado risk as well, mainly across parts of the upper Midwest, though I want to stress that this looks like a fairly limited area rather than anything widespread. Timing-wise for today, I expect storms to strengthen through the evening hours as they push from the upper Mississippi Valley into the Great Lakes region, with the wind threat becoming most pronounced somewhere in the 6 to 9 o'clock window for a lot of these areas. There's also a secondary batch of storms I'm watching develop out toward the desert southwest, mainly in response to some monsoonal moisture interacting with daytime heating. And those could bring some gusty winds and brief heavy downpours to parts of Arizona as well. By the overnight hours, I think the main line of storms continues to work through the central plains before gradually weakening as it loses daytime heating. For tomorrow, the threat shifts a bit, with our best chances for storms now focusing on the interior northeast, including parts of western New York and western Pennsylvania, along with some more scattered activity across portions of the southeast. I don't think tomorrow brings much in the way of a tornado threat anywhere, but damaging wind gusts will still be possible out of the stronger cells, so it's still worth keeping an eye on the radar if you're in either of those zones. Looking further ahead, I think Friday is where we start to see severe weather chances tick up a bit more with better instability and stronger forcing, setting up across the mid-Atlantic and into the northeast. That threat looks like it continues into Saturday and Sunday as well, essentially setting up an extended stretch of active weather for the eastern third of the country right through the weekend and into the start of next week, with the Great Lakes and Ohio Valley also getting drawn into that threat zone by the time we reach Monday. So if you've got outdoor plans anywhere along that corridor over the next several days, I keep a close eye on the forecast as we get closer, since this looks like it could end up being a fairly active multi-day stretch rather than just a single afternoon of storms. As far as rainfall goes over the next several days, I don't think we're talking about anything catastrophic for most of the country, but there are a few spots worth flagging. Down in the southwest, particularly southern Arizona, I think we could see 1 to 2 inches of rain out of this ongoing monsoonal pattern, which is honestly a welcome and fairly typical amount for this time of year in that part of the country. Across the central U.S., especially southern Iowa, eastern Kansas, western Missouri, and western Illinois, I also think we could see rainfall totals adding up to somewhere in the 1 to 2 inch range as these repeated frontal passages continue to march through. The southeast is also going to pick up some decent rainfall, especially across central and southern Florida, where I'd estimate another 1 to 2 inches is likely over the next several days. And finally, up along the mid-Atlantic and into the northeast, the higher elevations of the interior sections, along with parts of the Ohio Valley, look like they'll see the most notable rainfall totals out of this whole stretch. Elsewhere across the country, I think most areas are looking at generally light amounts, so this isn't shaping up to be a major flooding concern anywhere at this point, just some beneficial rain in a lot of spots that could probably use it. Now let's get to something a little different, and that's our upcoming partial solar eclipse, because I know a lot of you have been asking about this. Coming up next week, on the 12th, we're going to have a partial solar eclipse visible across parts of North America. Now, I want to set expectations properly here, because this is not going to be anywhere near the kind of dramatic, sky-darkening event we saw with the last major eclipse that crossed the country. This is a much more modest partial eclipse, and where you live is going to make a big difference in how much of it, if any, you're actually able to see. For folks up in Alaska, you're in the best position by far for this one. Some locations are looking at as much as roughly half of the sun being covered during the peak of the eclipse, with Fairbanks coming in a bit lower than that, and Anchorage lower still. If you're anywhere in Alaska, I'd definitely make a point to check the exact timing for your specific location and get outside with proper eye protection to take a look, because you're going to have a noticeably better view than almost anyone else in North America. For the rest of us, down in the lower 48, the coverage is going to be a lot more modest, generally ranging from around 10 to 20% in the areas with the best visibility, and dropping off to less than 10% as you move further from those better viewing zones. Generally speaking, the further northeast you are, especially up into New England and places like Maine, the better your chances of seeing at least some partial coverage, even if it's fairly subtle compared to what our friends up in Alaska will experience. Most of the visible partial phases across the US and Canada are expected to occur sometime around the midday to early afternoon hours, so if you want to catch it, that's the window to keep in mind for planning purposes. I do want to remind everyone, even for a modest partial eclipse like this one, please do not look directly at the sun without proper eclipse glasses or another certified safe viewing method. Even a small amount of exposed sun can cause serious and permanent eye damage, and that risk doesn't go away just because the eclipse itself is a relatively minor one. If you don't have a pair of eclipse glasses handy, there are also simple pinhole projection methods you can use to safely view the eclipse indirectly, and those work just as well for a partial eclipse like this one. Before I bring everything together, I want to spend a little more time on a couple of pieces here because I think there's some additional context worth adding, especially on the pattern change itself, since that's really the headline story today. Let's dig a bit more into why this particular pattern shift matters so much beyond just the day-to-day temperature swings. When we talk about the Pacific North American pattern trending from strongly positive toward neutral, what we're really describing is a change in how the jet stream is shaped as it crosses North America. In a strongly positive phase, the jet tends to run in more of a flatter west to east configuration across the northern tier, and that configuration is really effective at keeping ridges of high pressure locked in place over the western U.S., which is exactly why we've seen such a persistent and stubborn heat dome out there for as long as we have. As that index trends toward neutral, the jet stream typically starts to develop more waviness, more of those north to south dips and rises, and it's those dips, formerly called troughs, that allow cooler air from Canada to plunge further south than it's been able to recently. So this isn't just some abstract index moving around on a graph. It's a genuine structural change in how the atmosphere is going to be delivering weather to us over the coming weeks. I also want to talk a bit more about the Arctic Oscillation, because I mentioned it briefly, but I think it deserves a bit more explanation, given how much it can tell us about the weeks ahead. When the Arctic Oscillation is in a positive phase, cold air tends to stay bottled up closer to the pole, which usually means milder conditions for the mid-latitudes, including much of the US. When it dips toward negative, that containment weakens, and cold air has an easier time escaping southward. The dip we're watching develop around the middle of the month doesn't necessarily mean we're about to see anything approaching winter-like cold, especially not in August, but it is a solid signal that the atmosphere is becoming more favorable for these stronger, more frequent cool shots as we move deeper into the season. This is exactly the kind of signal meteorologists watch for when trying to get a sense of how a seasonal transition is going to play out over several weeks, rather than just several days. I want to also touch on how this pattern shift is likely to interact with our severe weather threat beyond just this coming week. As these fronts become more frequent and start digging further south, the boundary between the hot, humid air mass and the cooler air behind each front is going to become an increasingly reliable focus for thunderstorm development. That's actually a big part of why I expect our severe weather chances to keep climbing as we move through the end of this week and into the weekend, because we're not just dealing with a single frontal passage, we're dealing with a pattern that's going to keep generating these boundaries on a fairly regular basis. When you get repeated rounds of frontal thunderstorm activity like this, it does raise the chances that at least one or two of these rounds ends up producing more significant severe weather than what we're expecting with today and tomorrow's more limited setup. One more thing I want to mention on the temperature side of things is how this pattern is going to feel very different depending on you're talking about daytime highs or overnight lows. A lot of people focus purely on the high temperature for the day, but I'd actually encourage you to pay closer attention to your overnight lows over the next week or so, because that's really where the most noticeable change is going to show up first. Even on days where the afternoon still climbs into the 80s or low 90s, waking up to a morning in the 50s or low 60s is going to feel like a genuinely different season compared to the muggy, warm mornings we've been dealing with for weeks now. So don't be discouraged if the afternoons don't feel dramatically cooler right away, because the mornings and evenings are really where this pattern shift is going to be most noticeable in the near term. So let's bring all of this together because we've covered quite a bit of ground today. We are heading into a genuinely significant pattern change over the next week to 10 days, with cooler air becoming an increasingly regular visitor across the central and eastern U.S., even as the west and south central regions remain locked into a stubborn and persistent heat pattern. Riding along with these frontal passages, we've got an active stretch of severe weather ahead, starting with a lower-end wind and isolated tornado threat today and tomorrow, before things ramp up heading into Friday through the weekend across the mid-Atlantic, Northeast, and eventually back into the Ohio Valley and Great Lakes. Rainfall totals look generally modest across most of the country, with a few pockets of 1 to 2 inches possible in the southwest, central plains, southeast, and interior northeast. And rounding things out, we've got a partial solar eclipse coming up next week that will be best viewed from Alaska, with a much more modest but still visible partial phase possible across parts of the lower 48, especially the further northeast you happen to be. I'll keep tracking all of these details as we get closer, and if anything shifts with either the severe weather threat or the exact eclipse timing and visibility for your area, I'll make sure to update you well before it arrives. So let me know down below, are you more excited about the cooler temperatures finally arriving, or are you dreading it a little bit, knowing that fall isn't too far behind? Either way, I appreciate you spending some time with me today and going through all of this. Have a great day, everybody, and I'll see you again soon with the latest on how this pattern continues to evolve. Take care of yourselves and each other out there.